It started with 5 missing children in 2016. Now, 3 years later, we follow the trails of missing hunters. This Halloween, we bring you something truly special. Haunting true stories of the unexplainable, based on the book which documents 185 cases of missing people from 4 countries. The information from this former police detective, now turned investigator and author, will certainly blow your mind.
I appreciate the opportunity to present this as a standalone topic because I really think people need to understand how complex this is and how there are no hardcore answers.
So get ready, because the one and only David Paulides is coming to Edge of Wonder.
Hey guys, welcome to another special edition of Edge of Wonder with an amazing guest that we're super excited to have on, David Paulides,
who you might have heard from the Missing 411 series, and most recently produced a documentary called Missing 411 Hunted.
Generally speaking, hunters are very experienced and knowledgeable outdoorsmen. And so when one vanishes, you know something unusual has occurred.
As a hunter, you're like, I'm fine, I'm armed, I'm safe. There's no reason for why these people go missing.
They never found anything. Not the walkie-talkie, not his gun, nothing.
Obviously, an animal didn't get to him because there'd be a big scatter. Bees to find.
The FBI doesn't investigate missing adults. So then why would the FBI arrive on Tom Messing's case?
When you see hundreds of victims scattered throughout our national forests and national parks, you have to question the reality of it.
So he could have made fire. He had a gun, he could have signaled help. What happened to him?
I'd like to know, but I don't think we ever will.
Whatever it is big, and we started recording them.
Frequencies go way above and way below the abilities of humans.
I look, I'm thinking, what is this thing in the trees? It went from like tree to tree, and then it disappeared.
Is it possible for an 82-year-old man to simply vanish while sitting alone in the woods? Can a man with severe hypothermia hike 6 miles through snow with no shoes? This is one of those recurring phenomena. It's going to happen again. It's just a matter of time.
None of it makes any sense.
So David, welcome, and we're super excited to have you on the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. It's my honor that you asked me to be on.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we seriously have been wanting to have you on for a while, and our fans have even said, hey, bring on David Paulides. So when we found out that you want to be on, we were just like, oh my gosh,
yeah,
this is awesome.
We've been full on geeking out for the last couple of weeks. This is great.
I'm humbled to be on your show.
That's great.
Well, David, we've actually composed a bunch of questions that we have for you regarding this documentary and all of your research that we're going to basically go through with you and try to get everyone out there, aware of, everything that's going on in that head of yours after doing all of this research, and I think a lot of the difficulties of producing this documentary that you just published.
Well, I'll do the best I can. Be easy on me.
Sure. So before we get started with all this, for some of the people who may not know you, can you just give like a brief background of yourself and, how you, because I know you went from being a police officer in California to doing what you're doing about these missing cases, so missing person cases. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I spent 20 years as a California police officer, worked detective, street crimes, vice intelligence. Left there, went to technology. I had a master's degree in human resources, so I ran some HR groups in the technology zone in Silicon Valley. After that, I retired again, moved out to Denver, and when I was out here, I started some other research. And what happened was, originally, I was doing some background work on a case at a national park, and I noticed some national park rangers were kind of following me around. And at the end of the night, one of them knocks at my door. And he says, "Hey, Dave, we know who you are, and we know you've worked and you've published some books in the past, and we wanted to tell you a story." And the first ranger started to tell me that he and his partner had worked at a series of parks in their past. They had worked at a series of missing persons cases, and they realized that the people were going missing in areas that you really wouldn't think was normal. Normal would be maybe deep in the back country, in the middle of nowhere, and they had those cases. But they also realized that during that first 7 to 10 days that someone went missing, there was a lot of publicity, there was a lot of searching, etc., and then all of a sudden it went dead, nothing. And it concerned them that when they made some inquiries to their own department about the status of the cases and trying to get more information, they were thwarted in those efforts. And later on that same night, his partner came by, told me the same basic story. And they said, somebody ought to be looking into this because there's a lot of missing people in the parks. So the next day I called some friends of mine. I said, "Hey, check out these national parks and see if there's many missing people." A couple hours later, I got a call back and said, "Yeah, it's strange. There are a lot. And there's not a lot of information out there on them." So what I did was I filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests against the National Park Service Police. And if people don't know, the National Park Service has their own police department, fully trained federal law enforcement officers, trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. They have better training than most policemen in the US. And about 6 weeks after I filed for a list of missing people from the Park Service, I get a call from an attorney from the National Park Service, which was odd. And the first question was they asked, "Why do you want the information?" And I said, "Well, that can't be a legal reason why I get the list or not." And they said, "Oh, no, that's not it. We just want to know." I said, "Well, I'm just using it for research." And they said, "Well, we want to tell you that we have no lists of missing people from our parks."
Oh my gosh.
And guys, that's a really, really odd statement coming from a group that knows the political consequences of not keeping track of missing people. And I said, "Well, no lists from any park or a cumulative list at your department headquarters." And they said, "Nope." So I ended up getting off the phone and we talked amongst ourselves about it. And they said, "Well, maybe it's a semantical issue." So we resubmitted. Another 6 weeks later, I get a call back, same guy, same attorney, and he says, "Hey, no, you got it. There's no lists." And I said, "Okay, well, I'm a published author. So I want to use my exclusion from the Freedom of Information Act that says that a published author can ask the government to go out and get the information from them and for free." So I says, "I want to use that and I want you to go get the list for me." And he goes, "I'll get back to you." Another 4 weeks go by, the same attorney calls back and he goes, "Hey, we ran your name through the library index and your books aren't in enough libraries to qualify for that exemption."
Jeez.
I'm on.
Well, and just to let you know, there is no exclusion noted like that in the Freedom of Information Act. So I don't know where they pulled that from, but it was discomforting. So I said, "Okay, well, let's play this game. Let's say I had the money and I want to pay you to go out and get the information. So I'm going to pay the National Park Service to go get a list of missing people from their entire system. And I also want a list of people from specifically Yosemite National Park." And he says, "Okay, let me go out and get that number from you." Another 4 weeks go by, 5 weeks. Guy calls me back and says, "Okay, from Yosemite, it's going to cost you $36,000. And if you want it from the entire system, it's going to be $1.4 million.
What?
Yeah, that's kind of what I did. It took my breath away.
Do you think like they're charging you this because they don't have it, or that it would cost this much money to actually gather this information?
So, in my humble opinion, one of the best investigative journalists in the U.S. is a guy named George Knapp, who's head of the investigative division for CBS News in Las Vegas. And I told George about it, and he had me on his show on Coast to Coast one night. And he said, "Dave, they're flat out lying to you." He goes, "They don't want you to have it for whatever reason, but they're lying. They have a list." And since then, I've had other people tell me the same thing, that they have a list, but they just don't want to make it public. And kind of, let's zoom ahead 7 years from the point I first requested that till just about a year ago. All of a sudden, The investigative division of the National Park Service, which is a group called special agents. It's like they're detectives, National Park Police detectives. All of a sudden, they produce a list of missing people from Yosemite. And people said, oh my God, disclosure's happening. They're being more open. No, it's just that they produce a list of everybody I've already written about that I went out and found through archives. So the list of missing people from the National Park Service as a whole has not come out, but the list from Yosemite came out, but you could read about it in my books.
Wow, that makes so much sense, actually, in a cynical type of way, but I'm not too surprised there.
Yeah, seriously.
So David, your first documentary, Missing 411, was all about kids basically disappearing across North America, right? What kind of motivated you to create part 2 of this? Why do another documentary? Why do you feel like this is important?
Well, if I could step back for a moment and talk about that first one, it's just titled Missing 411. It's a series of children who disappeared in national parks and rural areas. And at that time, Les Stroud, Survivor Man, and I had been talking about doing all kinds of things, and I'd done some work for him in the past. And he said, Dave, if you have a project someday, let me help you out with it. I said, okay. So there was a case of a small boy, a 2-year-old boy who disappeared in rural Oregon, and from a ranch area. And there's a large search, and 12 hours later, and 9 miles away from the ranch, they found this boy face down in the dirt. And I asked Les, I said, hey Les, how about if you meet me out at the ranch and we try to replicate this boy's journey in the middle of the night, 9 miles in 12 hours, 14 hours. He said, okay. So in that movie, part of it is Les trying to replicate that little boy's journey, which in the middle of the night, he stopped the whole crew and he said, hey, we're done. He goes, this is ridiculous. I can't complete it. If I did try to complete it, I know I'd walk off a cliff or kill myself. There's no way this little boy did this. And the reason behind that first movie was really to give the audience an understanding how ridiculous some of these stories are about the distances small children have supposedly covered in the wilderness. And so if I told you about a 22-year-old man who disappeared in, let's just say, Yosemite National Park, and they found his body 12 miles away, you wouldn't think much of it because a grown person can easily cover that amount of ground. But if I told you a 2-year-old child covering that amount of distance in just half a day over 2 different mountain ranges and over fences, if you're a parent or you understand children, you'd say that's ridiculous. So that was really the reason behind that first movie. So in covering the children, that's one facet of the disappearances I've written about. And another one, which I wrote a book about, it's called Missing 411 Hunters. It's about a group of hunters that disappeared in the wilderness. And what's unique about a hunter is that the vast majority of them are hunting in grounds that they've covered in the past. Some of them have hunted on grounds that have been in the family for multi-generations. They know those grounds like you know your backyard. They're also armed, and a lot of times they're carrying communication devices. So in them disappearing, it's unique because they're armed. They know the area. Many times they're carrying technology with them, and it's a unique set. And I knew that there were stories out there in the book, and I think in the book I wrote there's maybe 115 different cases of missing hunters. And we went through there and we tried to pick out some of the cases that were fairly current, were unique, and represented different parts of the US. And so after a lot of give and take, we decided on a handful. And probably the biggest obstacle in all of these movies is getting the cooperation from law enforcement. That's number one. And number two, finding a family that wants to participate. That's another big hurdle.
Really? Yeah, actually, when I saw some of the law enforcement that you were interviewing for this movie, I was actually kind of surprised because I know how hesitant a lot of them are, especially when you're making a documentary that's going to be a public movie. So I was just like, whoa, that's great that you guys were able to do that.
Well, one of the things since the movie's come out, some ridicule about, well, these stories aren't really unexplained, they aren't unusual. And I know this is coming from people that couldn't have watched the movie because unusual, unexplained, those weren't my words. Those are the law enforcement people's words. And if you watch the movie, are you saying that the people that actually did the investigation don't really believe this?
Well, and not only that, but some of the cases, and we'll be getting into some of those a little bit later, the facts revolved around those cases are strange and unusual. Yeah. There is nothing not strange and unusual about them. I mean, obviously, like, you know, this is one of those things where, I would imagine, you know, it's easier to get someone in one of these rural areas, especially sheriff departments and stuff like that, to cooperate than it would be in bigger cities. But I can imagine them being very defensive about stuff like this.
Yeah, and like, what would you say to the people who are saying, well, you know, there's obviously some explanation and, you know, this whatever, you know, what would you say to those people specifically about these cases? Like, for using an example like this Aaron Hedges, that was probably one of the weird, you know, more shocking and kind of the weirder ones that was presented in the movie.
So one of the things that we do before I even write a story in the book is go through a vetting process. And part of that process is to eliminate a case based on animal predation, meaning a mountain lion attack, a bear attack, something like that. If there's any evidence that something like that has happened, it won't be in the book. If there's any type of mental health issue, it won't be in the book. If there's some type of criminal element somehow associated with the disappearance, it won't be in the book. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm eliminating all the low-hanging fruit that would explain that disappearance. So what you're left with is the truly unexplained. A lot of times people say, well, Dave, you know, we heard that there were 800,000 people missing in the US last year, and that was an FBI statistics. Well, what you have to understand is the real story behind that statistic. 800,000 people really didn't disappear. Every time a teenager, let's say, runs away from home and the police are called, and the policeman writes up a report on a runaway, that's one missing person case. They come back 2 days, case is solved. They run away again 2 weeks later, another policeman comes out, writes another report, it's another missing person case. So the cases that I write about are usually less than 0.5% of that huge total. Wow. It's a very, very small group.
I see. So let's kind of talk about with both of the movies, you know, what kind of, I mean, obviously you must have gotten some really good feedback from the first one in order to do a second one, but what was some of the feedback that you personally heard from both of the movies?
So first of all, I think a lot of the public doesn't understand the families of a missing person. During that first 7 to 10 days that a child or an adult goes missing, a lot of press, a lot of police officer attention, a lot of search and rescue people all over there. At the end of that time, nothing. Everything stops, and that family's supposed to go home and live with it. Many times there's not even a secondary search. If there is, it's mainly organized by family members and friends. So when somebody's been missing for months or even years, and anyone of any notoriety, and I'm not that famous at all, but anyone gives it some attention and says that they're going to give it some press, family members are ecstatic, because in all missing persons cases, publicity is really important. A lot of times it's people going through the woods and they say, hey, we know a person went missing here, so if we see a hat or we see some clothing or something weird, maybe we ought to report it. Whereas if you were just in the woods and you didn't even know about anything, you might not even think about it. So publicity is super important. And in the cases that we've worked with on both films, the families are really, really appreciative that anybody even cares. And then once you hear their story, it's gripping. It's really sad. They have no closure in life.
Edge of Wonder.
So Dave, you've investigated more than 1,200 missing person cases, but we kind of wanted to know, for you, what has been the strangest case that you've come across? If you could narrow it down, because I know that's probably asking a lot.
There's a lot of them that are probably pretty strange, but I guess is there a couple of them that stand out, or maybe not ones that were even almost like too weird to put in the movies, or anything else that you've came across?
You know, if I've written about it, I'd put it in a movie. They're all pretty solid. I like to think that the cases I do write about, they're all pretty strange, but probably one of the stranger cases that has always stuck to me just because it's a young boy. It happened here in Colorado. Northern Colorado was the Atadero case. Jaryd Atadero disappeared on a mountain trail. He got ahead of some people who were supposed to be watching him. He walked up to some fishermen on the trail that was next to a river, and he asked the fishermen, "Are there any bears around here?" And he had a stick, and he was hitting the stick in the water, and the fisherman got mad and said, "No, there's no bears around here. Stop that. Just, move on." Now, the idea on a rural trail in the middle of nowhere, the two fishermen aren't going to take accountability for this little boy is odd. But he moved on, and he was never seen again alive. Right. And years later, some guys were 550 feet above that trail, and they found Jaryd's remains. They found his pants inside out. They found his skull cap, a tooth, and his sweatshirt. Colorado Bureau of Investigation worked the clothing, didn't find any blood, and his skull had some unusual striation marks all over it, some of them at right angles. It was very strange. And Harvey Pratt from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation at that time, I sent him the pictures that Mr. Atadero had, and he had the skull at that time, and we took more photos. And I sent those pictures to Harvey, asking him if he could talk to their forensic examiner about it, because the people out here probably didn't have the exposure that this older professional in Oklahoma had. Harvey said he would. So this guy who had handled 5,000 field forensic examinations of bones, I think he was 82 years old, he looked at it and he told Harvey, he goes, "I have never seen something like this before." And I don't know what caused it, but it was something very, very sharp, because the cut marks in the skull were very deep. Well, the Atadero case is covered in our first movie, and Mr. Atadero played a big role in that. But there's all kinds of left turns, right turns in that disappearance that really, really make no sense. And to this day, the sheriff down there still says, Jaryd was killed by a mountain lion. But Mr. Atadero was smart, and he took all the evidence to 4 different mountain lion experts, and they all said, boy, he wasn't killed by a mountain lion. And essentially, the sheriff just wanted to wash his hands of the case and not even work towards an explanation, and just dropped it.
Man.
Yeah, I mean, because like you said, his clothing was laid out, and if it was by a mountain lion, a mountain lion wouldn't take off his clothes and then eat them, right? A mountain lion would just rip it to shreds, and you would find pieces of clothing, not a whole pants that's turned inside out, correct?
And they'd find blood on the clothing.
Yeah, that's the other thing too.
Yeah, and they found no blood. The clothing wasn't torn to shreds. Other part of the story is Jaryd always wore shoes, but he never tied his shoelaces, so they just barely hung on his feet. And if a mountain lion or a bear had grabbed him and drug him up the side of that mountain, it's a flat-out guarantee that those shoes wouldn't have made it up to where his skull cap was found. And within 50 feet of that skull cap were found 2 of his shoes. So that's another part of the story that doesn't make any sense at all.
Do you feel comfortable, in your understanding of investigating so many of these, do you feel comfortable coming to some kinds of conclusions on what some of these could be, what some of these may not be, or, do you have any understandings of your own?
So let me put this in a perspective that everyone would understand. I may be a mile wide, but I'm only about an inch deep. And I may be really good at finding these cases and deciphering them so that you can understand what happened. But that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in all the unusual aspects of the world. And when I speak at, say, UFO conferences, Bigfoot conferences, paranormal, Fortean, all these different types of conferences. There are experts at these that I'm not. And I don't know what happened to these people. And I have never had anyone who's read all of the books tell me that they have the answer. I get a lot of strange feedback from somebody who watches a few YouTubes of me talking, and all of a sudden they have the answer. But once you understand the intimate facts of each case, then you have to stick by those facts that point to a suspect. Now, before your audience moves on from this, I should say that we only have one YouTube channel. That's the Can-Am Missing Project. If you see a YouTube channel that says David Paulides, Missing 411, Missing in National Parks, those are not me. Most of them aren't even me in the videos talking. They're frauds, don't even watch them. But there's a lot of bad connotations out there about me from these channels where people are trying to make a point. It's not even me. So that's just for educational sense.
What's your main channel again, just so everyone knows? And we'll put the link below too.
Yeah, it's like Canadian American Can-Am Missing Project.
Yeah, so David, there's actually more and more people now believing in UFOs, especially after this whole ATIP and the Navy announcing UFOs are real. So we kind of just wanted to know what your thoughts were about this. I know you've seen a lot of strange things. I know you don't necessarily come to conclusions on these things, but did you feel comfortable kind of saying what you think about that?
Let me give you an interesting story. I was doing a conference in McMinnville, Oregon about 4 or 5 months ago, and all of the speakers were there, and I got placed in a room with Lieutenant Commander David Faber, who was the pilot that saw that Tic Tac UFO.
No way.
That's awesome.
Yes. It was one of the most interesting hours of my life. He was a super credible individual that led an unbelievable life. And he would talk to you just like I'm talking to you right now. And he said, Dave, he goes, we didn't know what we were coming up on. It was him and his partner pilot. 2 planes were flying simultaneously at this thing that was just off the ocean. And he said, it moves so fast. He goes, our planes couldn't even come close to it.
No, I took an auto track. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at it fly.
And the interesting aspect was they were on a training flight off the Nimitz. And they were redirected by one of their radar personnel to this unusual thing off the ocean. But they were supposed to go to this other location to train. And so after this Tic Tac kind of takes off and does some wild things and then disappears, Dave tells me that the radar officer goes, Lieutenant Commander, you're not going to believe where this thing just showed up 50 miles away. And he goes, well, where's that? He goes, that's your training site. It's sitting over your training site right now. So Faber and the other plane turned and went towards the training site. There's a lot to the story that the public doesn't know, but
wow.
I
didn't even know that.
I'm telling you, the guy is super credible.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, there was details there that we'd never heard before, and we've read so much about that that whole, thing. I mean, that's crazy.
It's really crazy. Let's see. I'm trying to think where we can go because there's so many different things we can go on from this point on.
Well, I mean, one of the weirdest things in that whole documentary, I thought, was how you kind of talked about the FBI agents showing up at a random, it was an 82-year-old hunter, and they showed up when they hardly ever show up for these things, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why do you think the FBI is getting involved in some of these? I mean, it just feels like they know more than they're leading on.
Yeah.
So the FBI has a profiling division, and what they do is they get reports from all over the nation, and they try to cluster them together to find commonality amongst the different crimes and see if there's a string of action that all can be pointed to one person, one thing. And back in the 1950s, I was writing about a series of missing kids in the Great Smoky Mountains area. And the FBI was showing up on these cases. This is way up in the mountains. And they'd tell the press, hey, we're just here to monitor the case. We're not here to help or do anything, but just here to monitor. Well, that's really FBI lingo that they're writing reports. They're documenting what happened to these people. Now, in the Hunted movie, there's a case out of New York where all of a sudden 2 FBI agents show up in the middle of nowhere where this guy disappeared and start monitoring the case. And one of the search and rescue commanders, I asked him in the movie, I said, did you call these people? No. Do you know who called them? No. Did they offer you any assistance? No. Have you ever had the FBI arrive on a search and rescue that you've been on? No. So I'm not the brightest bulb in the room, but I've identified a series of commonalities amongst all of these disappearances. I call them profile points. The biggest one, and the one that's gotten the most press, is that when they bring canines to the scene, the canines can't pick up a scent of where the victim went. They can't track them. And I think the FBI knows that something really unusual is happening. I think they're documenting it just the same way I'd document it. And they're sending all these reports to Quantico, Virginia, to their profiling unit, trying to get a handle on what's happening. And when the FBI agents spoke to the victim's wife, they told her, they said something really unusual happened. Otherwise, they would have found your husband. And then when you couple that with that there was another hunter, maybe 50 to 100 yards away from where this guy disappeared, also sitting on the ground, and that person hears a really odd sound in the woods, a sound they've never heard in hunting for 60 years. What is that? And that sound troubled that hunter enough that he told us that on his own.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, and you mentioned that, I remember in the documentary, it's mentioned that it almost sounded like a trap or something, perhaps. I mean, no one knows for sure, right? But if from the hunter's perspective and his experience, which, by the way, was like 60 years experience, like you said, he's thinking this was some kind of noise that was similar enough to a trap to call it that. I thought that was really weird.
Yeah, he took him a while to find the words. And then when he found the words, I went to his son and I said, hey, has your dad talked to you about this? He goes, oh yeah, it's bothered him ever since this happened. And it's almost like a big piece of metal clanking together. That was the best description I heard.
That's really weird.
And you know, not because this is like, I used to watch the movie The Predator all the time when I was a kid.
Yeah,
and I mean, I thought it was one. I couldn't stop thinking about that movie when this was going. Of course, those were the jungles in where was it, Vietnam or whatever? Or I'm getting confused with Rambo, perhaps. Anyway, the point is that. It kept reminding me of it because it was like, these, but what didn't make sense, obviously, which is in the movie, is the predator is looking for someone who's in shape that he can compete with, that he can feel like he's gotten, he's championed someone. Whereas this was an 82-year-old guy. Like, why even bother if it was a trap? Like, that doesn't make any sense unless there's something else going on that we're not even aware of.
Make a note that 82 years old, one eye, hard of hearing, bad knees.
Yeah, and you'd think if you're in any kind of danger or trouble or anything else, like the first thing you would want to do is, one, like get higher if there is, if you are in danger, not to like run away somewhere in the middle of nowhere and be completely lost. Or the second thing is find an open area where people can find you, or go back to where you originally were, knowing that that's where they're going to be looking for you. So,
and then combined with the fact that, and you even told the story in the documentary, that any one of these experienced hunters who has all of this gear, who knows what they're doing, they know how to be found if something like this happens. There is a protocol for it. They will follow the protocol, and none of those protocols are followed, and they just disappear out of nowhere or something.
Well, and this person who did disappear, he had taught hunter safety classes.
Oh my gosh.
To your exact point just a second ago, what to do when you're missing. He taught those for 40 years. So The idea that this specific person disappeared and they found nothing. And even one of the search and rescue commanders in the movie said, well, we should have found at least his gun, because that never goes away. And they couldn't find that.
So why do you think national parks have really been a focal point of people missing? Because, you know, you guys had the map on the movie, and it showed these like pockets of area where it's actually, you can kind of pinpoint clusters where people are disappearing in these national parks. And do you think there's something to that, or maybe something that people aren't paying attention to, or, you know, is there something going on in these areas?
So let me back up a bit. So when I was a policeman and we had a rash of crimes, say we had a serial bank robber or rapist, we'd always have a big map on the wall in our office, and we'd start to put pins in where the person committed their crime. And it would kind of give you an idea. Sometimes there was momentum as to which direction they were going and where they would hit next. And after I started to do the investigations into the missing people, I had stacks of reports all over my living room. And I started to remember that certain areas kept replicating themselves. And I thought, wow, there must be a lot of cases in this area. And I thought, I'm going to order me a big US map and just start putting pins in where these cases are. And after hundreds of cases, there's clusters that started to form geographically across the US. Right now, there's 60 geographical clusters in North America and southern Canada. And a lot of people say, oh, well, obviously they're all in national parks because that's where people all visit. Incorrect. These clusters appear in areas that may not be the biggest visited area where people go to the outdoors. As an example, there's clusters that surround the Great Lakes. There's clusters all up and down the Appalachian Trail, all up and down the Sierra Nevada mountains, going north through the Cascades, through Washington and Oregon, kind of around the top of Idaho, Montana, down into Wyoming, Colorado, and ending in New Mexico, Arizona. And then the most unusual part is right through north to south in the middle of the US, there's essentially nothing. It's a pretty big gap. And what I want to say to people is that the map you're going to see online that somebody copyrighted us on and violated our copyrights isn't the map of what it is today. That one, we were greatly advanced. A lot more numbers are on this map. And really, we believe water plays a big role. 80% of all the disappearances are within 250 miles of a major body of water, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, or the Great Lakes, or a major river. So somehow or another, water plays a big role in these disappearances. That, mountains, boulders, etc. The biggest cluster of missing people anywhere that matches the profile points, Yosemite National Park. Now people are going to say, well, you know, that's a real rugged area, and well, I've been in Yosemite many times. Not nearly as rugged as some national parks in the Rocky Mountains. But one thing that Yosemite has is that probably one of the greatest congregations of boulders, granite, in the world. And I've stated in my books many times that boulders and granites are associated with these somehow because people disappear in and amongst it a lot of times. A lot of times people disappear in the valley floor of Yosemite, not just deep in the backcountry. In one of my books in the 1950s, a graduate student from UC Berkeley was there with his family, and he said, hey, I'm just going to take a 2-hour walk up the valley. I'll be back. Guy disappeared, was never found. 2 months later, another graduate student from UC Berkeley, also in Yosemite, doing almost the identical behavior, he disappeared and was never found. The second family was there for weeks looking for their son, couldn't find him. The two graduate kids from Berkeley didn't know each other, but the Park Service wouldn't tell the second family about the first family, but the media did. Then the families got together and started to compare notes and said, wow, the disappearances are so similar. And they wrote a letter to President Eisenhower, and I got a copy of the letter from the Eisenhower Library. And it's an appeal to him to send in mountain troops to look for these two young men. He wouldn't do it. They were never found.
So, I have a question kind of coming off of this. There's been a lot of talk recently about, Area 51, and there are these kind of knuckleheads who are talking about, storming Area 51 or whatever. Yeah, they're knuckleheads. Anyway, this is strange research, and it would be a strange data point, but I was wondering if you had come across any information or done kind of some sleuthing to see how close these disappearances were to any kind of strange bases or anything that were out there. Have you seen any of that, or have you looked into that at all?
So just as a matter of coincidence here, guys, almost the entire state of Nevada is devoid of missing people that match my profile. There's a few cases right on the perimeter of California. There's some deep almost right by rural Las Vegas, but essentially there's nothing out there. And when you talk about deep bases or hidden bases, I don't put a lot of credence in most of that, because unless there's some factual substance to that base being there, I don't even believe it. And the reason being is that I go down this rat hole and I start to believe different things from different people, then I start to look like a fool. So when I'm at a conference and I'm giving a presentation, I like to say I live in the world of facts. And in my books and in my movies, I deliver facts. I don't ever give a hypothesis. I've never given a theory. A lot of people like to say, well, he's part of that big conspiracy theorist crowd. Well, how? Because I've never given a theory, and I've presented you with facts of unusual coincidences in all these cases.
Yeah, you really encourage people to form their own understandings. From my understanding of really looking at your movies and watching some of your interviews from previously, you're never like, this is it. You're just like, hey, I'm just presenting information I've found, and you guys can come to your own conclusions if you want, but I'm just showing you the weird stuff that we kind of found.
Well, if you go to our YouTube page and you look at the comments under the trailers after people have watched the movie, you're going to see some real interesting statements. And in general, again, if there was something that I could point to with credible validation of what was happening, I'd point to it. And if people say, well, he knows, well, if I know, then other people know, then where's the answer? Because no one's presented it. And therein lies the conundrum of the entire missing 411 disappearances.
And they had, in the 1970s, recorded these sounds. I did not understand what was going on.
They saw strange things in the air, strange things in the ground, strange sounds. And the analysis came back that it was outside the range of human. There were multiple entities talking over each other.